Tere. It's a delight to be back in the country I should have been born in. In a sense, my parents are refugees who received a safe and secure home and harbor in 3 nations, and I've had the privilege indeed of coming back to this nation, the country of my roots, and spending some 20 years living here and working, as mentioned, working on several projects, including one on bilingual education, which has been called by Fred Genesee, who's one of the leading academics in the field, one of the most systematically developed programs of its kind in Europe, possibly the world. The clicker's not working. Hello, hello, hello. Gentlemen, we're too far away? Up. So now it's working. Finding common ground, building an education system that supports perspective taking and multilingualism. Well, there's nothing new about bilingual education. There have been bilingual education programs working successfully for hundreds of years. But if one is trying to set up a national system or a large system, it is quite another thing. It is a major innovation. It requires people taking a different perspective, thinking outside of their mainstream discourses, their mainstream patterns of thoughts. And innovation is something that requires perspective taking. It requires empathy. It requires openness. It requires cooperation. And it's not a challenge for young people to participate and be successful in bilingual education. It's a challenge for the adults to get it off the ground. That's what I intend to do. Can you just read that for yourself? So it's about the do's and don'ts of bilingual education. And just to define one's terms, and very shortly and briefly, we're talking about using at least 2 languages to teach high-status subjects throughout the years of education, with an ultimate goal of biliteracy. So ensuring both high levels of literacy in the L1, the first language, and in the second language. This will be the structure of my talk. I think it's always useful to look at a non-example, what went wrong, and learn from that. So some key conclusions. Bilingual education is possible. When it's done, it works. When it's done well, there is 50 years of exceptionally well-researched evidence about this. This is one of the best and most thoroughly researched topics in education. We know it works if it's done well. You need the right investments. And it also needs to be well planned and managed, and that doesn't mean from up above. That means co-creating programs. That means working with a broad range of stakeholders to reach an agreement on something that will work. But let's look at an unsuccessful attempt first. And I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, actually, to call it a completely unsuccessful attempt, because there were many successful aspects to it. It's a bit too black and white. I apologize for that. Malaysia. Here's the ethnic makeup of Malaysia in 2010, according to the Department of Statistics. 50% of the population is Malay, and Malay speaking. 22% is Chinese. Interesting, we're having a color issue. Colors have changed somehow or other. And 7% is Tamil speaking. So the Malays are the majority, but barely. And that does create some concerns when people feel threatened. So in 2002, the Prime Minister announces a decision to teach maths and science through English, starting in 2003. Not a very long lead-up time, but still some planning time. And why? Well, a desire to compete globally and a feeling that English is simply a basic skill. Inspired by Singapore and India. But then again, Singapore is an English medium country. It does offer some mother tongue education, but even the term mother tongue is often rather unusually defined in Singapore. So a Cantonese speaker may suddenly be learning Putonghua as his or her mother tongue. So these were comparing apples and oranges in a sense. Knowledge and information explosion taking place in English, and the feeling in Malaysia was that people need English to get access to this knowledge base. So they had a very systematic, well-planned approach. It consisted of textbooks, some very, very fine textbooks, activity and workbooks, teacher guides, pupil and teacher CD-ROMs. Remember those? Glossary. Glossary of terms, exceptionally important to agree on terms. It's something we were just doing, was being done in the last session. Teacher training and research, very well thought through, a great deal of money invested, and it did enjoy a certain amount of success. But it was a major undertaking, starting at several levels in the education system and trying to institute this change throughout the entire system in every school in the country. A bit overambitious. In 2009, there's a phase out of the program begins, so that's 6 years later, and by 2012, the program is shut down. So what went wrong? Street protests by Malays who were concerned about their language. It got to the point where the government used tear gas, whether they needed to or not. It's questionable whether they needed to. But there was some serious unrest. Rural students were disadvantaged on several levels. First of all, there were less qualified teachers in the sense of English-speaking teachers who could teach science and maths, science in rural areas. And there was opposition from the Tamil and Chinese schools who were concerned about the negative backwash effect it might have on their first languages. And there was a feeling that bilinguals are advantaged, that means the Malays and the Tamil speakers, and that monolinguals, meaning the bilinguals being the Tamils and the Chinese, and that the monolinguals, once again, I'm painting these things in very broad brushstrokes. There are plenty of bilingual Malays or trilingual Malays, but that monolinguals would be disadvantaged. And in fact, what happens on, for instance, the examination results? There was a drop in science results by about 3%. In cities, in cities it was 2.5%. When students were studying through English, and in the countryside it was 2.5. That 0.5 is enough for a parent to say, my child might not get into university. A very small difference, but big enough to cause major concern. So on average, just over half of teaching time in classes that were supposed to be taught in English were actually taught in English. Many teachers did not have the language skills they needed, and especially in rural environments, and many teachers lacked the pedagogical skills. It's one thing to try and skill up people working in 20 schools. It's another thing to try and skill up, help people to rather skill themselves up to become more effective at doing bilingual education and speaking English in all of the schools in a nation. So what are some of the lessons that have been learned, not just from Malaysia, but other places where this has been attempted, whether it was South Korea or Hong Kong, where there are different degrees of success, or from around the world, where there are an extraordinary number of successful bilingual and even trilingual programs. So I'd like to repeat, the bilingual education is possible. Kordus on tarkus ema, as we say in Estonian. Repetition is the mother of all knowledge. So it needs the right investments. It has to be well planned, and it has to be well planned together with the stakeholders. First of all, review the research. One needs to base one's discussions on a solid knowledge base. So we're not discussing opinions, we're using solid facts. And I'd just like to point out that there is an extensive research base about successful programs. And here, this is just some of it. Recently, the United States, the Academies of Engineering, Science, Engineering, and Medicine did a great meta-study, an overview of the literature as well. The next key point is start small. Don't try to do everything at one time. Pilot schools, that is something that can be done, that people can handle. So run a pilot, include rural and urban schools, learn from the problems and successes, improve plans, and you're going to increase the likelihood. It makes it very hard to argue once you have hard data that hopefully someone will have researched, as Hiaser and her team did in Estonia. But this, okay, the image isn't perfect. You could probably even get it off the ground, as it happened in Malaysia, but it is a step too far. So pilot schools is, I think, the way to go. You can always move to more schools, as we did here. We started with 4, we moved to 8. By the time my association with the program ended, we were up to 50% of Russian-speaking schools were offering bilingual programs. And then one continues to simply step-by-step expand. Do what you can as opposed to try and do the impossible. As we have another expression in Estonian that I love, üle oma varju ei hüppa. You can't jump over your own shadow. Do what you can. So research the pilot. We need to learn from the mistakes, have independent verification of results, and absolutely need to engage universities in the process. It shuts those people down, in a sense, who long enough that they will hopefully think, the ones that are just speaking from emotion as opposed to fact. So central is working with one's stakeholders. And just to define the term, any group or individual that can be affected by or can influence the organization. So it's anyone who can help you or cause you trouble. These are just some of them. And I'm putting students at the top and trying to point out that it's not none of those groups are monolithic. There's a great deal of diversity within student groups, whether it's boys, girls, people from socially disadvantaged backgrounds, socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds, etc. And those are just some of the stakeholders. And I think if there was one strength to the Estonian program, is that a great deal of time was spent engaging with stakeholders and co-constructing the program. And that is, I think, one of the things that led to its success and deep politicization. It wasn't politicized. So there are other stakeholders as well. I think it's important to always ask who is missing. There's always somebody missing from the conversation. And if we don't ask ourselves that question, I mean, publishers are certainly another group that belongs there. I was just at an OECD meeting where we're looking at a program for well-being on a national level, and also looking at stakeholders. The media, as was mentioned, is an exceptionally important stakeholder. Here in Estonia, I think we embedded, if I dare to use that word that's been slightly tainted, several worked very closely with people in the media. Government officials, national, local, regional, from all parties, those that are in power, those that might be in power next year. And Aboriginal peoples in many nations is also a major issue. But that conversation, if we don't include those stakeholders, that's what might happen. Somebody might rock the boat because we're not taking into account their interests, we're not taking into account how they might affect the program. But that conversation always needs to be grounded in solid knowledge, research-based knowledge, in a sense, skills that we've agreed on, attitudes that we've tried to agree on, values that we've tried to agree on. And then it tends to work quite well. That's what Ontario uses as a motto in its education system, and I think it's a nice, short, catchy phrase worth holding on to. Basically, it's important to get stakeholders around the table, make sure the conversation's taking place on a solid base of knowledge, agreed upon skills, attitudes, and values, that one is talking policy, practice, research around that table. When one is trying to create an excellent bilingual education program, it needs to be effective, relevant, it needs to be efficient, it needs to be practical. It's all one ecosystem. I mean, you give more resources to bilingual education, some are going to come away from somewhere else. But then again, bilingual education can contribute, and often does, to the reform of an entire education system, or at least other schools, in that it is an innovation and others can learn from it. It's absolutely essential. You need to tell me when time is an issue. I hope you're keeping a look on it. I didn't look at my watch. Oh, I see. Wow, technologically very advanced. Thank you. Show how L1 will be protected, the first language. That's essential. People are afraid. We may think that we can think rationally, that cognition is something that is purely rational. It absolutely is not. All aspects of cognition that are most heavily recruited in education, for instance, such as learning, attention, memory, decision-making, motivation, and social functioning, all are subsumed within affect, are profoundly affected by affect. And there's a vast body of literature on decision-making, and it shows that ultimately, no matter how rationally you think you've made your decision, that decision is finally made through an affective filter. So make sure rural and minority language schools get greater support. Make sure those who are going to scream the loudest are getting some support. And hopefully that's not your only criterion. Rural and minority schools have special needs, and if urban children get better access to L2 and universities insist on L2 skills, this will add to social problems. Korea tried to create a bilingual education system where they were going to support everyone in learning English. What happened is people from rural areas started to send their children to cities and spent even more money on helping them learn to speak English. Expectations need to be high, but they need to be realistic. It is one of the most powerful things in education, period, if you take a look at John Hattie's syntheses. High but realistic, it has to be high expectations for all stakeholders, for all languages. Certainly one needs to raise public awareness. Here in Estonia, we also ran a reality TV show on our immersion program and immersion kids. There are a million things that need to be done. One needs to identify fears, address them, stress the value of mother tongue, stress the fact that it is an additive program, and stress the value of trilingualism. That trilingualism slipped in there because, let's be realistic, bilingualism is passé. Trilingualism is an absolute minimum. That's a minimum. There are a heck of a lot of people in this country who are quadrilingual. And one of the key issues is, this is my friend here, if he represents the dog, if the dog here represents the education system, then one thing we have to be very careful of is the assessment piece. So for instance, in Hong Kong, the program got in a little trouble because of the assessment system wasn't aligned. And it begins to wag the dog. The tail begins to wag the dog, an expression used in English for something happening that shouldn't happen. And fears, of course, can shake the system even more. So we need to align assessment with program goals and to ensure that we don't have unintended consequences. So plan thoroughly, much more than training teachers. It's not, in most countries, going to be a one-size-fits-all. I've been working in Kazakhstan for the last 6 years. It's going to be very difficult to make one program that's going to work for the entire nation. There's some real challenges there. Okay, you can't teach maths and science, teach geography. You can't do it in the whole nation, do it here, do it there. Involve stakeholders, create clear targets, clear measurables, be transparent, discuss your problems, try to seek solutions. So finally, once again, bilingual education is possible. It needs the right investments. It also needs to be well managed. And well managed doesn't mean from top down, it means a co-constructive process with stakeholders. Aitäh. Thank you.